then it took me to a sentence that you said to me before, which is the importance of operationalizing growth as a set of loops versus funnels. Can you help me? What is a loop? What's an example of one?
Yeah. All right. So growth loops are a concept that, again, I've referenced Reforge a few times. It was popularized there. And I have to drop Greylock here for a moment because Kevin Kwok and Casey Winters, two of the people that kind of made this concept, and they were at Greylock at the time, also working on Reforge. I think in general, the definition for loops is they're closed systems where the inputs through some process generate more of an output than reinvested back into the input. And so there's different types of loops. I referenced the content one from Pinterest early on. That's actually a good example. Like a user onboarding and using the product generates the output of that, generates more content that goes and feeds back into the search algorithms that is the input into acquiring new users, right? And so basically usage begets more usage, new users beget more users. That's really the concept that you're looking for. And so loops, they're powerful because they lead to compounding growth systems versus typically funnels, are more linear growth trajectories that will oftentimes decay with scale. And so the way to engineer loops oftentimes involves kind of product efforts versus just marketing. And that's when we talk about growth, that's a concept that's kind of fundamental to it.
So totally get that in terms of the circularity of loops and how it feeds back into each other. What's a funnel then, just so I have that clearly?
Yeah, I mean, that's the traditional way that marketers think is funnels. So just looking at, it's a very common way of just looking at the path of marketing or growing a business. So one framework, I think this might be Dave McClure's, but it's the Pirate framework, AARRR. So top of funnel really starts with awareness, then acquisition, activation, retention, revenue, and some might add referral to the end. The problem with this is this leads to siloed teams. Typically, brand marketing might do the awareness stuff, then you have performance marketing doing acquisition, and then that might get handed off to some conversion PM that's working on activation. And so you're really missing opportunities to have interplay between these steps and go and reinvest outputs from one step into the other. For some businesses, again, like e-commerce stores, it's just the most practical way to look at a business. So it's not like, funnels are bad all the time. But I think if you look at your growth this way, you will typically see a degradation of performance with scale. And that's ours, probably the best, the most common framework for funnels. Yep.
So when you say about operationalizing growth as a set of loops versus funnels, what does that mean now we know what loops and funnels are?
Yeah. All right. So when I think about the practice of growth, it's about building distribution strategy into your product strategy, and then finding harmony between products, channels, and monetization. And so this is very different than saying, hey, we have a product team that's going and building stuff, and then we have a growth team, whether that be marketing or sales or whatever, going and growing stuff. And I think the whole practice of growth is about creating more harmony and actually introducing distribution strategy into your product. And so part of getting at this is org structure, right? So as I mentioned before, structuring an org around a funnel creates silos, and teams will optimize at the expense of one another. And so I gave the Stitchfix example of hey, I could send a bunch of shitty quality leads through, and then retention is hit. So when your company thinks in terms of loops, teams are forced to think about the interplay between different components. And so it's less about road mapping tactics to reach some local optima on a specific metric, and more about seeking these compounding results. And so most teams decide that cross-functional teams are kind of the best solution. And this is a core part of operationalizing, because I think these cross-disciplinary teams also come up with better ideas. But the other things that might kind of fall under your operationalizing is going and redefining new interim metrics and saying, hey, this is actually something that lives between acquisition and retention, but this is actually going to be, this maps more closely to the North Star of our business, and this is what we're going to try to move.
If we think about optimizing loops, we need to build this habit of experimentation and iteration within the business and learning. How do we build a process around that? Because there's a lot of kind of buzzwords there, iteration, experimentation. Yeah. How do we do that?
Okay. Yeah. So there's two principles, I try to emphasize before getting into the mechanics of how you run this process. I think one is the best ideas could come from anywhere within the org. So reducing friction to bring forth ideas is something that I think the head of growth should think of themselves as responsible for. And the second is the only real failure is not implementing learnings from an experiment. So you need to have a culture where it's actually okay to take risks and fail in the spirit of learning. Any process could sometimes be have a negative connotation as, hey, it slows you down. And, sometimes people that are hyper aggressive and want to move fast end up being process averse. So really, when I think about process here, it's designed to ensure we're working on the right set of things and are then going and compounding learnings. It's not to force unnecessary approval layers or slow us down. So I think mechanically, the process I've introduced in both the companies I led growth for, there's kind of four main components of it. So I think first is experiment one-pagers. So anyone could submit an experiment idea. Anyone, even if you're not on the growth team. But we built this very simple kind of one-pager framework that included an objective, a hypothesis you're testing, the design or resources required to execute the experiment, the timeline, so how long you need the experiment to run, and then what success quantifiably looks like. So you're not actually going and having revisionist history on hey, it actually did work, even though, the data showed this. And then finally, the next steps that one takes if the experiment fails or succeeds. So when you have that one pager, those ultimately fall into a triage list, which is most of the time just a Google sheet. So in one spreadsheet, anyone in the company could go and look at a prioritized list of experiments and see what's running at any given time, what were the results of ones that ran in the past, and also, the head of growth and the growth team should be triaging these. And so one framework that's used to triage that's common is the ICE framework. So impact, confidence, level of effort. You score every idea on these three attributes, and it's a little bit rough, but that kind of prevents the test everything mindset and the stuff that is the right balance between high impact, but maybe not high cost and a reasonable level of confidence that it might work. Those will rise to the top.